Hello and welcome to Access Chat. I'm delighted that we're joined today by Caroline Bristow, who is the director of the Cambridge School Classics Project. I met Caroline at the Business Disability Forum event celebrating the Disability Smart Awards, where Caroline and her project was one of the winners. But we got into conversations about the work that she was doing and then actually disability representation in history, which is a topic that got me excited as my background being in history long time ago. That's almost ancient history now. But I was super interested by the topic and couldn't wait to get Caroline on to talk about the work she's doing through the School Classics project, but also a little bit more about the sort of understanding of what went on in ancient history and the representation of disability. So, Caroline, great to have you with us. Can you tell us a little bit about your role, please?
Thank you. So CSCP, which is a lot less of a mouthful than Cambridge School Classics Project. So CSCP has been around for 60 years next year. It's our birthday. So it was set up by with a grant from the Department of Education in the 60s to essentially try and promote the teaching of Latin and the ancient world in schools in the UK. I don't think anybody expected it to last as long as it did. I'm pretty sure the original team were not expecting it to still be going 60 years later. CSCP is best known for the Cambridge Latin course. Some research that I did in 2017 suggested that I think something like 93% of schools in the UK who did Latin at some point used the CLC. So it's fairly strong. I've had complete strangers at weddings come running up to me shouting Caecilius est in horto, which is incredibly strange. But that's that's what we're best known for. My job outside of that has a research element to it. You know, I basically get paid to sit and think about classics education. And that can be actually producing stuff using classrooms, training teachers, advocacy and policy work. I'm incredibly lucky. Basically, I get to very much control the direction I take the project that's under my care. I have a very varied role. I don't really have a typical day, which is quite nice.
That sounds great. But you particularly won this award for the work that you did on inclusion. In the teaching material, so maybe you could explain a little bit about what you did there.
So the CLC, Cambridge Latin course, has been around for a long time, and the last revision of it for the UK market, UK International. Basically, there's two editions. One of them, Deborah, you'll be pleased to hear, is just for North America. The North Americans have their own version. It's got far fewer U's in it. And the other edition is used the rest of world. The rest of world edition hadn't been revised for 25 years. And the North American edition had been revised in 2015, but reasonably lightly in some places. One of the things that really hadn't been touched was disability inclusion. That wasn't one of the priorities that was done in that revision. So as an education specialist, my big focus as a professional is on inclusion and intersectional, especially inclusion. So essentially, I wanted to make sure that this new edition was inclusive and accessible all the way through the process. So I made a commitment to things like the consultants we were using. So we obviously use academic consultants to check material, etc. So I made a commitment to using a range of consultants from different sort of marginalized or less prominent groups. And then, of course, in the content itself, a commitment to making sure that we were representing different groups of society in in better ways. And that's a really rubbish way of putting it. But there's a difference between inclusion and good inclusion, as I'm sure you're very aware. It was actually trying to think about how we were doing it. And I was very grateful. I've got a wonderful team who I work with who have got very similar kind of obviously drives an ethos. So yeah, we basically took it apart at the seams and then tried to look at how we could improve things. Nothing's ever perfect, so you can't create. I always say it's towards a more inclusive book rather than creating an inclusive one. You can't create something that's inclusive for everyone. That's impossible. You can just move things forwards each time.
Caroline, welcome to the show. Do you mind explaining it a little bit more to me? Because I understand, the Cambridge School of Classics project, but do you mind just explaining it to me a little bit more? Because I'm thinking something that it's probably not correct. Are we talking about one book? Are we talking about, because I know you said before we went on air, there's a huge US market too. So do you mind just wrapping your hand a little bit better around it for me? I apologize.
No, don't apologize at all. I'm obviously very used to speaking in a context where I don't necessarily have to actually remember that not everyone knows what the book looks like. So it's a Latin course. It's a beginner's Latin course, and it's what we would call a reading course. So back in the 1960s, when they first developed it, it was really unusual in its pedagogical approach. And in the 60s, it was built deliberately to be an accessible learning tool. That was the point of it. Wow. And that was the 60s. So it made some decisions which then got undone because they were crazy. And the people who made them won't mind me saying that, because I think they would agree. They did things like strip away grammatical terminology in the hope that that would stop being a barrier to learning for children, because otherwise you're learning, if you think about when you're learning language, rather than learning the target language, you're learning language to talk about the target language. And actually that's a barrier, because if you think about it. And so it tried stripping away all of that language about language. But actually all that does is almost store up other problems. Because if you had an ecosystem in which everyone's doing that, you'd be fine. But otherwise you just kind of create learners who are lacking a piece of knowledge that allows them to unlock other things. So that got undone. But reading courses, essentially, you focus on the ability to read Latin, is what it sounds like. They've been shown to be so basically I don't know if you guys did languages at school. It is highly likely that when you were taught languages at school, depending on your ages, but it's very likely that you did an awful lot of drill and kill. So can you remember learning verb tables a lot? Yep. Okay, so this actually tells me a lot about generations as well. So Deborah's got her eyes.
So yeah, I was that target audience of the people that made those mad decisions, because I learned no grammar at all.
Yeah, there we go. So it's really interesting for me, because I can literally be like, oh, I know roughly when everyone was at school from depending on your context.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that is the traditional way of learning language. Traditionally, when we were learning second languages, my mother says that she can remember, my grandfather was in the RAF, she can remember walking around air bases, conjugating French verbs. Sorry, you decline nouns, but conjugating verbs. And that is what you did. We now know that that works for a really small percentage of learners. Really small. Myself included, it does not work for me. I always thought I was really bad at languages. So the CLC was built on a completely different system. And so basically it's built on an idea of you read the language and you use inductive logic to work out how it's working. And then you allow the child or student, any age, to create a mental model of how the language is working rather than trying to force a model onto them. It's a very, very gist way of doing it. In order to do that, you have to have stories, because children like stories, and well, everyone likes stories. So the series is a 4-book, is a 4. It was 5 in the international market. It's going to drop down to 4 in this edition. 4-book series, and there is an overarching plot. So the plot, there is a story that starts in book 1 and finishes in book 4.
Right.
And that plot is fictional, it's fictionalized, but it's deeply rooted in in historical research. I will never say reality because we're always constructing history. You can't really say that it's reality. Our rule is things have to be plausible, if not necessarily likely. So, for example, book 1 is set in Pompeii, and the volcano does indeed go off in the final chapter. And there are some survivals which are deeply unlikely, given the fact that these people, according to the stories, were in Pompeii at a particular point in the eruption. The chances of them making it out were very, very small. But yeah, so that storyline is what we're talking about, basically. So yeah, it's a beginner's Latin course, reading focused, very much focused on accessibility to all learners, and its backbone is this narrative set in the 1st century AD.
Caroline, as an American, something that I think that we have failed at in our country, I know we haven't failed at very much, but one thing that we have, shut up, Neil. One thing that we have failed at is we're not teaching. We have not been deliberate about teaching languages like other countries, and I think it's really hurt our country doing that. And one thing that I think is fascinating about what you're doing beyond, what we're talking about is, I've always heard Latin is the basis of all of the languages, right? I mean, there's some foundational work there. And so it feels to me that the work you're doing is more important than maybe I'm understanding in a way, because I think that's fascinating what you were talking about, how they took some stuff out to make it more accessible, but it actually probably made it less accessible by the way that we learn languages. And so I'm really intrigued by that part of it, because you were talking just a little bit before we went on air about the amount of people that have used these courses. And I was just wondering, and you mentioned it a little bit here too, and then I'll be quiet and let Neil and Antonio come in. But would you talk just a bit again about how many people have used these?
So, as I say, in the UK, in 2017, it was about 93% of schools who did some Latin, and that's not the majority of schools. Please, anyone around the world watching this, please do not think that all schools in the UK are teaching Latin. That would be lovely. They're not. So in the US, the US is a really interesting space to work in from an education perspective, because I spent a lot of time over there, because you're so decentralized. So in the UK, we can kind of track how much Latin there is because we have national exams. And so I often refer to Key Stage 3. So that would be your kind of late middle school, early high school. So kids between sort of 11 and 14. I often talk about Key Stage 3 being like dark matter classics. It's a bit like in physics, right? We know dark matter is there because we can see the effects. We know Key Stage 3 classics is there because we've got Key Stage 4 or GCSE or kids who are between 15, 16. We know they exist, which means they must exist further down the school, but we can't track it because there's no national data. We just have to kind of work out local networks, etc. The US is very similar. You guys are so decentralized that even tracking things like your AP Latin or the National Latin exam, a lot of programs won't be aiming towards those. And so we can't really track very easily how many learners there are. You've got organizations like the American Classical League, ACL, who will have a good handle because that is their remit. And things like that, and the individual regions. So you've got the Classical Association of New England, or CANE. You've got the Classical Association of the Midwest, and I want to say South. I'm so sorry, guys, if I've just named you wrong. I just know it's like CAMS because I know what the acronym is, and I can't remember what it stands for. But and you've got these regional networks. But yeah, so these are really there's Latin in the US is a bit like Latin in the UK in that there is a small but very strong community. Because the US is so big, that small percentage of schools, of course, means there's more people. It's a very, very vibrant community. There's a lot of pedagogical difference in the US. Something the UK is not quite the same. There's an awful lot of pedagogical kind of variety in the US. There's a real move towards the accessibility and inclusivity. Certainly, sort of 2020 through now has been a real push in some areas, less so for others. You get a huge melting pot of it, really. But most states, I'd say, like basically anywhere that you have like Latin is reasonably strong, the CLC is a well-known book and a lot of people will be using it. We sell enough units in the US to fund my team. So, and we do not have that generous a publishing deal because that's not how publishing works. So, I mean, it's reasonably generous. I'm very grateful for it. But, you know, it's not a case of like, you know, we're being overpaid for it. So, yeah, it's a pretty big kind of market. There's thousands, hundreds of thousands of people around the world who will use it. We have people, my favorite one is, we received a video from Sierra Leone of some children in the school of Sierra Leone using the book. So
Good.
Yeah, it pops up all over the place.
That's got to be very gratifying. So thank you for making it more inclusive.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm not sure. I think Antonio has a question.
So, in terms of research, how do you find ways in order to identify people with disabilities within the context of history and bring them forward in order to be part of the history itself?
Yeah. So one of the really key things is, and this is, I'm massively kind of going to lean on other people in a way, because I think somebody who I think articulates this very well is a scholar called Alexandra Morris. I heard her speak and she put this really bluntly, where she was like, one of the biggest problems is when we think of, and this is true in the modern world as well, when we think of people with disabilities as that monolithic group, because that group doesn't really exist. You know, I have a hearing impairment. That gives me a totally different life experience to somebody with a sight impairment. And yet we would both fall under this umbrella of person with impairment, you know, and that's the same in the ancient world. And we can also, you see a lot of very sweeping generalizations. So the Romans were awful in a lot of ways. Like, I am quite comfortable with that statement. I often say to teachers, if you are not teaching your children to be Romans, and if you are teaching your children to be Romans, please stop teaching your children to be Romans. That is not going to improve anything. But we know that there was a societal prejudice, I suppose, or bias at some level towards bodies which were not impaired. Like, that makes sense. Like, we know that there were certain rituals people couldn't do if they had impairments or things like that. But we have to be really, really careful not to say everyone in Roman society was really prejudiced against people with impairments, disabilities, because that's ridiculous. You didn't check, you know, and that's where we have to guard. And I suppose that can be really difficult. And I get around to actually directly answering your question. That is something that can make finding those individuals very difficult, because when you've got as a historian, you are often working with a presentation of somebody or what has been recorded. That will often be recorded with a purpose, or it can be very difficult to unpick what is actually going on. My favourite example, though, is in one of our third book. There is an aulis player. An aulis is like it's like someone joined two recorders together. I'm sure that historians of music are now screaming because they're just like, no, it's nothing like that. I think.
If you think of Pan.
Yes.
Pan is playing an aulis.
Like a two parts.
Yeah.
They often accompanied, they accompanied an awful lot of theatre shows, pantomime dances, etc. And there is I think he's 2nd century AD. Again, I get him wrong. He's called Meropnus, and we have a gravestone of him. And the gravestone of Meropnus is basically, it says on it, to the gods below, to Meropnus, aulis player with dwarfism. And is basically a really interesting source to use because it's a self-presentation. Obviously, he didn't carve it well, he might have carved it himself, I suppose, if he knew he was about to die, but we can assume that the person who is being buried didn't actually write the epitaph, generally. But things like that do give us a sense of self-presentation, because you're not going to set up a gravestone for somebody saying something that they wouldn't have liked or wouldn't have resonated. That would be a really specific form of insult that most people don't use. So what we can tell, and there's actually a picture of Meropnus on his gravestone as well. It's a really interesting source. And what we can tell from the fact that he is to Meropnus, aulis player with dwarfism, his musical skill and his dwarfism are taking equal billing there. So they are equally weighted in parts of his personality or parts of his self-identity. So Meropnus, that gravestone was actually the basis for one of the characters of our later books, who actually is the aulis player who accompanies a pantomime artist who has an affair with the Empress's wife. That ends very badly for him. And the reason I find him very interesting as a character as well is he's a really interesting one because it's such an interesting sphere when you start looking at people who, the traditional narrative is this is somebody who is being marginalized or is being exploited. And that is completely true. It's quite possible that was happening. But there's been more modern work done, often by historians on who mainly focus on the Victorian kind of, the Victorian shows where they just literally had people with different bodies on display. And there's been lots of historical work done on this, and that attitude, which actually feeds very well, is this idea of we can't always tell how the individual felt about it. We might feel very uncomfortable with it, and actually we might be rightly feeling really uncomfortable with it. But it's completely possible that someone like Meropnus was leaning into the expectations of his audience, aimed to his dwarfism. And he may have found that incredibly annoying. He may have wanted to be just the aulis player, not the aulis player with dwarfism. But equally, he may have found it funny. He may have found it liberating. He may have found it a way of making use of his body in a way that was empowering. We can't know. And so we have to be really, really careful about projecting that sense of helplessness.
Well, but we also know that the Roman society was also a society at war and permanent states of war.
Yeah.
And with war, it comes people would serve in the army. When they return back to their families, they cannot accomplish what the family expect that person to do because that person might have not be able to fit to work or have a disability. So it's interesting to see how ancient societies will see that person in their own social context.
Yeah, it's so military disability is really interesting. So we could, if you look at some of the jurists, people who are writing about the Roman legal system in sort of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, we can see that there are certain laws where having served in the military is not an out, that's not quite the right word, but we can see that if your impairment or disability is as the result of your service, that's taken into account. I really wish I could remember a specific circumstance. But yeah, that we see that a couple of times. Ideas of you cannot do this thing if you have a disability unless your disability was gained through service. There's also a really interesting idea that I came across So Romans were very organized. I one thing they come up have taken away from them. And so when they founded towns and cities, they often would they had very specific characteristics, and they were founded along particular charters. Sometimes they grew up organically, but that was a specific kind of town or city. And they had these things called coloniae. Coloniae were specifically founded for veterans. And so when your soldiers reached the end of their contracts, they might be offered land in a colonia. And a really interesting idea I found when I was writing the chapters in book 3, which are very much based in sort of a military encampment, is something that I thought was quite plausible, really, which is the idea of, yes, the assumption has always been that these towns were built up because these people had been in the army for 25 years and 35 years. And they wanted to keep that sense of discipline. They were used to that way of life, and being surrounded by people who had seen the same things as them was really beneficial. But actually, is there also an argument for if you're surrounded by people who might have the same injuries and who might have similar difficulties or are making the same adaptations? So it's not just about trying to perpetuate that military way of life, but maybe there is something going on there with people wanting to settle around people who understand, that very specific lived experience. The military is a really interesting example. And what I found really interesting rewriting the books is there's lots and lots and lots of military. There's lots of pictures of soldiers, none of whom have any wounds. That was something we really noticed, is when the previous illustrators had drawn them, we put in the injury, they just didn't have any injuries. And it's just that really interesting kind of like erasure.
Yeah, I mean, that still goes on today. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to recruit. But yes, I think that, and so maybe that's because the previous illustrators were conditioned, because all that we see are pictures of non-disabled military. We don't show the after photos of people that have gone through military campaigns.
Yeah,
I could talk about this topic for a lot longer than we have time left for. I guess we've covered the Romans to a certain extent. We've talked about the military side of things. Do you think that, and we've talked about the importance of the representation in sort of memorials and so on, and I watched a great Mary Beard series on looking at all of the sort of memorials of ancient Rome and how that really gave a much better picture of society than a lot of the literature. Are there other elements of sort of historical documents or sort of things that, or maybe buildings and sort of monuments that you've seen that also influence the representation in your books?
Yeah.
Caroline, can I also come in because I want to, while you answer that question, one thing that I thought was very interesting is the cultures that they say that they really elevated people with disabilities, or even in some cases worshipped people with disabilities. Periodically I hear things like this, and I actually asked ChatGPT it, and ChatGPT said, well, yes, that did happen, and it actually named a few cultures, the indigenous and the First Nations culture in the North America, ancient Greece in specific cases, Hinduism in ancient India, ancient China and the Taoist thought, and the Middle Eastern and the Sufi traditions. Also African traditions. So, and they gave me some really, really good data about that. But as you're answering Neil's, I was wondering if you, because I know we are pretty much out of time, but I love this conversation. I was just wondering if you wanted to also explore that. Thank you.
Okay. So you can edit me down if needs be. So
We won't.
I'm gonna try and I'm gonna try and hit all of them. So okay, so starting from near what you were saying. So with the monumentalization, etc. So it's really interesting work done by Professor Carrie Vout at Cambridge. I saw a lecture by her, and something that I thought was really, really fantastic about what she talks about. She talks more about sculpture. But we have a tradition of the body beautiful that comes from neoclassicism, that comes from the fact that we have this idea of the classical sculptures being these, please forgive the massive this a lot around lots of things, the perfect bodies and the kind of that sculptural tradition. And Carrie would argue, and argues very well, that this is actually sort of a selection that has been developed in a more modern kind of context. And actually, if you look at an awful lot of the sculpture we have from the ancient world, we do have different bodies. We have the elderly. We have one of my favorites is an old lady who's got no teeth. And she's fabulous. We can see different bodies in the sculpture. And so, as with so often in classics, because the name, clues in the name, classics has been used so much to kind of perpetuate particular hegemonies that actually it tends to be very selective. So we do have evidence of sculptures of people with completely different bodies. One of the ones in the books is not a sculpture, it's a painting. It's what's called a Fayum mummy portrait, region of Fayum in Egypt, Greco-Roman portrait shoved on mummies, what it is. And we put one in the book, and he's got a scar here from eye surgery, and that's been represented in his mummy portrait and things like that. So we do see it in art, and we do see it in things, but it's not always what's picked up by scholars in later times, largely probably because of their own desire to use the classical for a very particular agenda, especially in the Renaissance or during the European colonization movements. So there's that one. Another interesting one in terms of documentation, something that I find really interesting, is kind of adjacent to your point, but I think kind of illustrates something, is the amount of, inverted commas, great men in history who actually probably are carrying physical impairments, and we know they're carrying physical impairments from the sources, but when we're learning about them, we forget them. It's a really interesting, I've been talking about this recently with a colleague, it's such an interesting process. That idea of disrupting hegemonic norms is really strong. So it's almost like this individual has an awful lot of power or is performing a very important role in our image of the past, and the disability just falls off, or we separate it. As teachers, we will do a lesson in which we mention that there was an impairment, but that won't actually be part of the narrative. It's a really interesting separation. So some examples of that, Julius Caesar, we know, had fits. That is recorded in a couple of different literary sources. Obviously one has to be phenomenally careful about backwards diagnoses. There have been some suggestions this might be something akin to epilepsy, but please take that with a massive pinch of salt. And then we also have people like Hannibal Barca and Philip of Macedon, both of whom lost eyes on campaign. In Philip's case, I think he took an arrow to the eye, and in Hannibal's case, he had an eye infection. And these are both men who, in the middle of their meteoric careers, lose an eye. And that is not something we tend to see really dwelt on, or we tend to if you ask a room full of people, they possibly might not even know. I actually didn't, to my shame, until a colleague pointed it out to me, and I'm a Greek historian, really. So the texts do mention it, and the sculptures are there. But what's really interesting is, as modern scholars or previous generations of scholars, their eye slides over it. And so that gets reflected and perpetuated in things like teaching materials and scholarship. To the comment about kind of the worship element, it's a really difficult one. So the Romans definitely out. They have a concept of it. So you do get Vulcan, god who's kind of got a bad leg, but the depictions of, you get some. It's a very. This is not my area at all, and yeah, I wouldn't say the Romans do it particularly. The Greeks, you have a little bit of particular individuals, but it tends to be really coded in my experience. Again, if anyone's watching this who happens to be a scholar of this, I'm really sorry if I'm misrepresenting your discipline. But so one of the things that in my own work, I work with myth a lot. I work with Greek myth specifically. There's a really interesting thing around sight, for example, in Greek myth. Individuals who see something they shouldn't, usually naked goddesses because it's Greek myth, and lose their sight, but almost get kind of like a quid pro quo, where you have like Tiresias who loses his sight but then gets given the gift of like prophecy, etc. And so that impairment and that disability kind of becomes this really odd, mystical kind of all tied up. Similarly, Homer, the blind poet, that blindness, we don't even know if Homer was a person. And so we certainly don't know the status of his 2020 vision. But it creates a mythos. And so you see that slightly more. So yeah, waving the not my area flag, but like, yeah, it's very specific, very context dependent, and often it's doing something. Like it's the use of disability and impairment or the presentation of it, it's doing something. It's got a cultural meaning or connotation.
Okay. Wow. Thank you so much for delivering that so quickly. We need to close now, but we'd love to have you back. But I need to also thank Amazon and my clear text for keeping us on air, keeping us captioned. Thank you, Caroline. It's been a real pleasure. I won't quote any Latin at you because I never took it.
I'll forgive you. I didn't at school, so.
No. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Been great.